important factor to be considered in the trade of hydrogen, and as such the measurement or certification of hydrogen is a must. Before we get into our discussions, I'd just like to introduce our panel to everyone. Firstly, we have Ms. Daria Maternik. She spent the last decade working in the fields of energy, climate and sustainability. She is the Director of Policy and Partnerships at the Hydrogen Council and is designated as the COP28 Special Advisor on Hydrogen. Next we have Mr. Gadi Taishin-Lumba. Gadi is the Chief Legal Counsel in Energy and Sovereign Finance for the African Legal Support Facility, which is hosted by the African Development Bank. He has been actively involved in assisting Namibia's green hydrogen program over the last 12 to 18 months. Next we have Mr. Guru Turkey, who is a Special Advisor for Fortescue Future Industries. Focus of delivering large-scale green hydrogen and ammonia projects on the African continent. And last but not least, Ms. Mercia Geises. Mercia is the Investment Director for Climate Fund Managers in Namibia. She's currently spearheading CFM's efforts in the green hydrogen sector and has been fundamental in establishing the H2 Fund Managers and SDG Namibia 1 Fund. Good afternoon to everyone.
Sure, thank you so much, and again, it's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you for this kind invitation. It's a real honor to be here with, of course, the government of Namibia, and first of all, congratulations on the government's really visionary objectives for becoming a real hydrogen champion going forward and unlocking environmental but also the socio-economic benefits of hydrogen deployment and really maximizing the local value creation. I think this is there is an extraordinary vision that Namibia has put forward, and I'd like to congratulate the government for that on advancing very promptly with implementation on the ground. On the certification side, and I would like to take a step back, I think that you, in the introductory address, you, I think, highlighted the very important aspect of how we need both solutions for assessment and evidencing of sustainability attributes. And of course, certification is necessary to evidence the carbon footprint, but also a number of other sustainability attributes of hydrogen. And we also need solutions and frameworks for assessing those sustainability attributes. And I would like to first of all highlight that just yesterday we saw the official publication of the ISO methodology for greenhouse gas emissions assessment of hydrogen from production to consumption date. And I think this is really a landmark initiative and a great testimony to international cooperation that is taking place. Of course, the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, has over 75-year history in developing global standards and has worked in hydrogen standards for almost 5 decades. And they have worked on taking the IPHE guidelines. Some of you may be familiar with the guidelines document that was established by the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in Europe, IPHE. It's a government-to-government initiative. So the guidelines that were established by this intergovernmental initiative, they were officially translated to ISO and used as a seed document for this international global standard. And I think that the development of the standards and this initial technical specification that has been released is absolutely critical, of course, to inform the relevant instruments, including certification schemes, going forward. On certification in particular, we see that governments across geographies, from Australia to South Korea, Japan, a number of European countries, the UK and others, are progressing with designing their own national certification schemes for hydrogen derivatives. And they are pretty much in a similar phase, where they're targeting the go-live of these certification schemes in about 2 to 3 years from now. And I think this phase where we are right now is absolutely critical, because we need to think of solutions that could help us avoid market fragmentation and ensure the fungibility of certificates going forward. I also think that this year we have seen some progress in terms of the international consensus on how we can achieve that. So if you look at the G7 and the G20 outcomes documents from the this year, they all unequivocally, as well as the IEA Global Hydrogen Review that was published just in September, they all point to one key recommendation: we need mutual recognition of certification schemes for hydrogen derivatives. And we know that with this year, COP28 presidency is really taking bold action to advance from this vision to real action on the ground together with the coalition of first mover countries. So I think that we will see some good progress on actually advancing this at COP this year.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Lara, for this great introduction, because I think you set the table. And I think you mentioned a really key concept that as GSF advising the government, many of the African countries are looking for the exporting potential. One of the key risks we identified quite early on is fragmentation of the market. Right? And we do not want to advise a country to take the highest standard and to apply it in a monolithic fashion, because it is the best or the highest standard across the world. And then be in a situation where the country will only be able to export in one or two regions. So you're locking the country into only one market, which is a significant risk. So what we advise is to participate to the global efforts to ensure that you have a global certification that will allow a level playing field across the world, which is the best for African governments, because that allows them to have only one standard. But the reality is they need to keep flexibility on the regulatory framework to be able to allow their private sector producer to potentially have different certification depending on where they will export their development. We can talk about the return a little bit after, but what is important is not the actual certification or the credibility of the process to certify. And once you have a good framework in place and an agency that will take on that responsibility, which certification you choose is not as much an issue. But yes, so it's been quite a journey, because initially, the project for electricity or other source of energy, you typically want to apply the highest standard, and now all of a sudden you're reluctant to push them towards the highest standard because you don't want them to have the opportunities to explore in other markets.
Thank you for that, Scott. Yeah, from our perspective as a developer, I think maybe it's important to take a step back and explain why we need this certification process, right? I think hydrogen, as we know it, is going to be a globally traded commodity, and the reason it's going to be a globally traded commodity is because the consuming zones and the production zones may not be the same, right? Like different locations have different scale and cost potential to produce, such as Namibia, where we have amazing resources and large scale to be able not just to use hydrogen locally, but also to export it to consumer markets. But at the same time, you have locations such as Europe or Asia where they don't have this huge capacity to produce, but they need to absorb it, right? They are the demand zones. So as a result, okay, we're back. So as a result, in order to enable this, let's say, the shipment of molecules from the places of production to the places of consumption, I think it's good to have some sort of global standardization so that one is aware of what type of molecules you're receiving. Because even as hydrogen, there's different types of hydrogen, right? There's grey hydrogen, there's blue hydrogen, there's green hydrogen. And with each one, again, there's different levels of emissions that one can produce of carbon dioxide as you produce this hydrogen. And that's where these standards come in, right? So us as Fortescue, we really believe, let's say, in the Green Hydrogen Organization standard. It's a non-profit that we helped set up the fund. And the idea really was to combine both climate ambitions with social, environmental, and let's say sustainability ambitions, so that when you produce hydrogen, you're taking all of that into account. So from a purely emissions perspective, what we want to do is make sure that whatever standards are applied, we reduce the carbon emission of hydrogen by 90% from the grey version, right? So what that means in practice is for every kilogram of hydrogen that you produce, you are producing less than 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now there's different standards that I advocate for, let's say 3 or 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of hydrogen. I think we're choosing the one that, where you're pushing your emissions target 90% below to what it is in the green hydrogen, in the grey hydrogen scenario. So, and the idea with this, and in Namibia's context, for us is one, okay, you can control the emissions and make sure that you apply the highest possible standards as a developer to ourselves, right? We're not necessarily imposing this on anyone else. Number two, you make sure that not just the emissions are being controlled in the export scenario, but you're looking after sustainability criteria for water, for the social sustainability, making sure that the societies are not badly impacted by these large-scale export projects, making sure that the rest of the environmental considerations are also well taken into account. So I think for us, as much as we want to produce hydrogen at a global scale, make sure that it's accessible for other industrial players apart from ourselves to decarbonize, we also want to make sure that, one, we're taking care of the environment, our carbon dioxide emissions at the same time, to the highest possible standards that we can, and this is, let's say, a standard that we aspire to reach. But two, make sure that, let's say, the local considerations are not forgotten. In Namibia, there's water scarcity, let's make sure we keep that in mind. The society, I think we've spoken a lot about the just energy transition. We make sure that, let's say, the local community is not negatively affected, but rather moves along in terms of this development journey. And that's what, let's say, these standards represent for us.
Very much, and thank you for having me, Scott. I think from a climate fund manager's perspective, I think it's quite important. If net zero is the target, it's essential that we have certification at the core of the projects already now in pre-fit and design phase. And as a fund manager, we've got the mandate from our partnership with the Environmental Investment Fund, as well as the partnership that we have with Invest International for grant funding, to make sure that we support Namibia green hydrogen projects in their pre-development and development phases, in ensuring that their designs are going to be compliant with the requirements that our off-takers and the off-take markets have. And at design phase already, we are implementing the highest standards from an environmental, social governance, and net emission perspective. And what is deeply entrenched in our investment philosophy is the IFC's performance standards, which whilst we are waiting for a fully fledged certification process, we've already started designing into our investee companies, or the companies that are benefiting from the development funding that we're going to provide. And net zero is definitely one of the key things that we're going to measure at production phase. But now already in construction and design, we have to look at impact on biodiversity, we have to look at community engagement plans, we have to look at transparency in the projects, beneficial ownership, transparency in declarations, tax compliance. So all of these governance aspects in the design phase, we're already helping to set up the projects in a way that we believe is going to help all of the sectors and industries in the
I think this is a great point, and I think to pick up on your last question, what does qualify as green at the end of the day? The answer is it depends on who you're talking to, right? And it depends on the country, because a lot of countries are progressing with implementing their own policy frameworks, as well as their own national standards for hydrogen. For example, we have the low carbon hydrogen standard in the UK with a threshold of 2.5 kilos per kilo CO2 equivalent. We have the US IRA with a band between 0.5 and 4 kilos per kilo CO2 equivalent. We have multiple frameworks within the European Union, as you know, 3.4 in the case of the Renewable Energy Directive, but also 3 kilos per CO2 equivalent for the EU taxonomy for sustainable finance. So even within one jurisdiction, we sometimes have multiple thresholds for qualifying hydrogen as sustainable or low carbon. So the answer is that depends on the jurisdiction, it depends on the different sovereign policy choices that countries are taking based on their circumstances, the infrastructure endowments, course, the resource endowments that they seek to make use of. And I think that, we see that there's a diversity of different policy choices that countries are taking. Again, South Korea and Japan are also crafting their own approaches. And I think that it's critical to focus on, if we're looking at the global development and the global standardization efforts, I think we can't solve everything all at once, but we need to take a stepwise approach. And definitely, I think for the, in particular, when it comes to the carbon footprint of product and the methodology to identify the carbon content of hydrogen, it's really useful to refer to a common global benchmark to make sure that you're able to assess and perhaps compare the differences in different national approaches, because in country A, a threshold could be, let's say, 2 kilos per kilo CO2 equivalent, and in country B, the threshold could be 2 kilos as well to qualify hydrogen as clean, quote unquote. But if you use different methodologies to assess the emissions, different system boundaries, those 2 and 2 mean different things. So being able to refer to, again, a common global methodology is extremely useful, because that helps us provide a common global benchmark. Now, of course, from our perspective, we see the ISO document as a really helpful point of reference, because it also incentivizes, of course, the reporting not only in the life cycle analysis basis, the emissions of the value chain, but also capex emissions, which is of course quite important, and that can make a substantial difference to the LCA calculations.
This country is going for a national framework. If I take the example of Europe, which is not a country, but the Union being quite rigid in having lengthy processes to achieve, are we not already a bit late in that process where if they do enact all of these frameworks, just to change it or to harmonize it will be quite difficult? And in your discussion with the countries, have you seen some openness to a global standard? Or this is still, the direction is still a fragmented market?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that there are different layers to it. So, of course, countries, they want to pursue their own national policy choices because they're being sovereign countries, and they have their own legislative frameworks. At the same time, we know that a number of countries, for example, refer to, in the early days, IPHE guidelines in the absence of anything else. And they are also quite open, of course, now to see that, knowing that these IPHE guidelines were officially transferred to ISO, the copyright on the guidelines is with ISO right now, and served as a seed document for the development of the methodology. Now a number of countries are considering this as a common global point of reference, which is useful. Now, does it mean that the countries won't introduce national, country-specific legislation? Of course not. Of course, countries will continue doing that. But I think as long as we have a solution to compare apples and apples and allow the least carbon-intensive solution to shine and the most truly sustainable solution to shine, we're in a good place while appreciating the differences in national policy choices that will remain. I think that the best is the enemy of the good, and if we're able to find a solution to be able to compare apples and apples, that will be a huge step forward.
Lucia mentioned earlier supporting developers in the early stage from a pre-feed and feed, in terms of designing in aspects that lead to a lower carbon content and approach being taken. That's pre-development. Once there's a development stage in play and there's a certification that it's put into practice regardless of location, how would you as a developer go about making sure that you're meeting those targets requirements and actually achieving the outputs that have been set forward in a set certification?
I think that's a good question, Scott. And the work actually, I think, as Marcia put it, should start before you implement. And I think there's certain organizations that are offering these kind of services already. I know the GHO recently published a guideline saying if you have projects that are at the pre-FID stage, happy to help. You can bring those projects in and they help you to help check their compliance with RFNBO status. In terms of let's say export possibility to Europe, checking compliance with the Green Hydrogen Organization standards itself. So I'm sure there are others as well doing that. So I think it's important to do that before you get to FID, so that whatever processes are designed, whatever project type is implemented, at least it takes into account what the future commercial aspirations of that project are, where you're exporting it, how you're exporting it, what the life cycle emissions of your project look like. So once you, let's say you are in operation, I think our colleagues have touched on it as well. There's various bodies, right? First, you have to select, I guess, which standard you want to apply. Then there's the certification process itself, and in terms of the certification process, there's various entities that can help. I know in Europe they certify everything. There's, the ISO, I think that Dario mentioned. There's the TÜV-SÜD, the certification bodies that exist in other, let's say, in other verticals that are applying, and developing hydrogen standards more and more. And it's important to have, let's say, a reputable organization to provide these standards, because ultimately, I think, from an African perspective, if you are exporting this, you also want to make sure you capture as much value as you can, right? I think that's the aim of this standardization, where if you're producing green hydrogen, you should be compensated for producing green hydrogen, right? If you have a product that has less than a kilogram of carbon dioxide emission per kilo of hydrogen that you produce, you should be compensated, similar to, let's say, something else that has 3 or 4 kilograms. So I think achieving the correct standardization is actually really, really useful in terms of making sure that whatever producer countries are capturing value from what the end consumer wants.
Just to add that and to come in briefly, I think that's a great point. And just to clarify, I think that we have, of course, standard development organizations like ISO, the International Commission for Standardization, that do not deal with certification, right? So just to make sure that we're on the same page, because they certification bodies and issuing bodies for certificates, they vary across different geographies and across different jurisdictions. For example, in Europe, you have voluntary scheme developers that can be that issue certification schemes that can be then used for compliance with some specific national, European legislation. In other countries, you have, and in some countries within Europe, you have different issuing bodies for certificates that are appointed at national level. And same comes for countries outside of Europe as well. So I think it's helpful to, of course, distinguish between, again, standards and certification solutions. I find that sometimes, people tend to mix the two, and it's just helpful to clarify that we have, standards on the one side that can be international standards, that can be national, which in many ways, when we refer to national standards, that's effectively a policy framework, right, and a legislative initiative in a given country. We have also voluntary standards, and of course, certification schemes that can be government-led and government-owned, and they can be voluntary as well. So I think just as background, it's helpful to differentiate between those different elements in the wider certification space. It's of course very complex and technical. And I would also encourage those of you who may be interested in the subject to look at the Hydrogen Certification 101 paper that we have published together with our colleagues in IPHE, National Partnership for Hydrogen Fuel Cells in the Economy, as well as with support from IRENA, the IEA Technology Cooperation Platform for Hydrogen and their certification tasks, as well as GIZ, the German Government Development Agency, and their PTX Hub. I think it provides a useful point of reference, and sort of really, it's truly a 101 on the basics of hydrogen certification. So if you haven't seen it yet, I just encourage you to have a look. Hydrogen Certification 101 document that is available online. Thanks.
It's a really good question and a really hard question. And we've seen it in the past. I don't think the history will be quite different in this case. There will be some level of manipulation. I think it's about continuing and making sure you keep credibility to the overall scheme ultimately get rid of. But at the end of the day, private sector, all they want is a level platform. They are also the best place to let you know how regulation can be done. So I think close relationship and discussion with the private sector to inform what should be looked at and how some of the standards can be tricked and what should we do to prevent it will be far from an expert, so I won't get into the details, but when you put in place a scheme or or legislation that will impact not only the quality of the product or the credibility of the product, but also the credibility of the jurisdiction in which that product is produced. It's a responsibility of the government to ensure that it puts in place the right incentive. So business, everything comes down to the bottom line. So sanctions need to be proportional to make sure that it's a real incentive to keep it certified. The issue here is that even if Namibia takes the right approach, we need global efforts, because we don't want to be in a situation where your private companies in your country do it by the book, but the rest of the world is manipulating, because then you're back to square one. So there will be some communication with your private sector, with the international community, and hopefully the threat of climate change will bring us together to limit manipulation. Because you can't get rid of it, but you can definitely contain it. The other point I would make is, I think, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this, but I do think that there's a bit of a difference between the blue and the green hydrogen products. Once you pass the capex, the initial investment, construction of new assets for green hydrogen, it is much easier to certify or to evaluate the performance of the production. Where blue hydrogen, because of the nature of the production, the constant capture of carbon, you keep that trend of emitting carbon dioxide across the production throughout. So it's going to be interesting to see whether one will be more prone to manipulation to the other. And I think if you look at countries like Germany that took a really strong stance for green hydrogen as opposed to blue, that seems to be kind of the fear in the background, is that blue ultimately could always still have some form of emission that will be hard to quantify and control.
And I think from our perspective, I fully agree with that as well. I think the reason we're so focused on green hydrogen is, I think ultimately we're trying to solve a big problem, right? I think we're trying to solve the issue of global warming. We're trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So you have to have big targets, especially in a nascent industry, where I think the reason we're advancing green hydrogen is because we want to avoid, let's say, perpetuating the use of fossil fuels, right? This is what will allow us, at least in heavy transport, heavy industry, and in the correct sectors, and fertilizers and so on, to decarbonize. So it's important to have targets that keep those big objectives in mind. So I think that's why we're so focused on trying to meet that 1 kilogram per, CO2 emissions per kilogram of hydrogen produced. I think, as Gadi put it, with blue hydrogen, we are firmly not in that sector, and that's because, again, it depends on your carbon capture efficiencies, right? So if your efficiencies are high, maybe it's the beginning of the development of that project, or the beginning of the life cycle of that project, perhaps you can achieve high efficiencies. Later on, there's chances of leakage. There's all sorts of issues that could arise, and I think that continuous monitoring will be important. But for us, I think the ultimate objective is to go green and make sure that we inspire communities, or let's say other industrial players such as ourselves, to go green, and try and always keep in mind what we're fighting for here is really global warming. It's a big issue. So I think we need to have big targets that fit that.
Thanks, Bree. Marisha, do you want to add anything onto that specific discussion?
Yeah, maybe just to say that as a fund manager, I believe we have a really critical role to play in holding our investing companies accountable in making sure that we play by the rules, especially when it comes to environmental, social, and governance aspects. And therefore, I believe there's a lot of value that we have in partnering with investing companies in making sure that we get our road to zero going. And we're extremely encouraged by the potential that green hydrogen offers to get us to reach the sustainable development goals and the impact that it can have. And therefore, we've set up this business in partnership with the Environmental Investment Fund. It's a specific fund manager that is targeted at unlocking green hydrogen
I think in closing, I'd just like to open to each of our panelists here, just in a quick summation, what's the way forward from a certification perspective in a media context? Just your thoughts, maybe starting with Richard and then working back. What do you think also use from a media context towards the certification, and what do you need to do?
I think the country's green hydrogen strategy is quite clear. It's the production of green hydrogen, renewables, 100% renewables. And what we need to do in order to get the 100% renewables and green hydrogen to a certification stage is to make sure we look at the value chain of how we get from producing this hydrogen. And in the design phases, as I've said, is the most critical work to be done to make sure that our supply chains are sustainable, our labor practices are sustainable, our impact on communities is sustainable, our environmental impact is sustainable. If we comply with these internationally recognized standards like the IFC performance standards, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals and how they set up, I believe that we can get to the certification. Certification will be driven and influenced a lot by off-takers. So wherever our key off-take markets are is where we need to start doing the research in order to understand what we need to get those off-take agreements signed and for us to be certified and accredited to deliver to those markets. And we are already working with internationally recognized consultants in the hydrogen sector through the various project developers that are engaged in the sector. And we believe that we should be able to get accreditation in the key markets that we're targeting, such as the European Union, South Korea, Japan, and the rest of the off-takers that the country has engaged thus far. And the project developers have shown commitment to delivering to the highest standards and getting their off-take agreements in the best price case through sustainable development.
Super. Thanks, Marsha. Bruce?
Thank you, Scott. I think Marsha has really summarized it very well, to be honest. There isn't much more to add but to say, look, as our projects are advancing in Namibia, I think this is the right time to plan about, regarding certification and standards, so that come production we're not ready for that eventuality. So I think now is the time to plan. Namibia already has a leadership position in terms of the hydrogen sector across Africa, maybe even the world. So I think it's good to assume that leadership position when it comes to certification and standards as well. And most importantly, we should always keep in mind that certification is not just about the numbers and the numbers of, let's say, emissions, but also the sustainability towards the community, I think, towards the environment and everything else. So I think that is really important in the African context. We have, these projects are not in a vacuum. They happen in a community that needs development, needs growth, so we need to keep that in mind.
Thank you. I agree with you. Everything has been said already, so I'll try to rephrase some of the details. But I'll just start just before that. We attended a government inception workshop about a month ago, I believe, in which we had a presentation from Mario, but we also had a presentation from the National Standard Institute. And I was really impressed by the Namibian level of expertise of the NSI and already their level of knowledge about green hydrogen certification. There's been already in discussion at an international level to understand how they should approach it. And that gave me a lot of confidence that this is already on the map as one of the key drivers of success of the whole initiative. Certification is for me the most exciting one for the municipal, the most exciting, not the most exciting topic, but it's such an important one. It's going to be the battlefield to ensure that you include the global south in this energy transition. And if you don't, you're not part of the discussion, part of the negotiation that will take place at the global level, and that you don't have enough flexibility in your national framework to be ready to adjust and anticipate what will come. I think that will have negative impact in a few years that provide enough flexibility for the private sector to be competitive. So these are broad statements, but at this stage I think that's the best I can have.
Thanks, Gadi.
Yeah, excellent points made by all my fellow speakers. So just to add in the end and build on Gadi's point, I think Namibia has already been doing tremendous work in terms of developing their own national hydrogen roadmap and strategy, and really moving forward with implementation on the ground, designing the enabling legislative framework. And of course, I have to also congratulate Gadi and colleagues for helping really shape and the enabling and legislative environment in order to be able to make these projects happen. And I would say that continued participation in the relevant international platforms and fora, where some of these solutions for hydrogen certifications will be advanced, will remain critical. And I think, again, Namibia is already doing that. And I think strengthening and continuing that participation in the relevant international fora to make sure that the solutions that are adopted by Namibia are future-proof, and Namibia can really make sure that they can be part of the truly global market and build new partnerships, new hydrogen partnerships with countries across geographies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dario. Gadi, Roo, Marisha. And if someone next door has lit up a cigarette, but it seems like not a bit of background noise there. Thank you very much to all of you for your time and your advice and expertise on the discussion today. I've certainly taken a lot in on that. And I think, rest assured that Namibia has already commenced with their thoughts and views and behind-the-scenes development of standards and approach to certification. So I think as we have already moved in terms of our green hydrogen strategy approach, that has also included a lot to do with what is that level that we want to achieve that's going to match the targets and goals set by countries to which we expect to export hydrogen in the years to come. So thank you again to all of you for joining us, and thank you to the audience for listening in. I hope it has been a good session.